Japan's Path to World War II, Ambition and Consequences. Picture this: a restless island nation, teeming with ambition, perched on the edge of a global storm. Japan, once isolated and humbled by centuries of tradition, had transformed into a force to be reckoned with. But dreams of empire came at a cost: the thirst for power, the hunger for resources, and a clash with mighty Western powers. This was the cauldron that would push Japan into the inferno of World War II. How did it all unravel? The answer lies in the final desperate years before the war, where ambition and desperation danced a dangerous waltz. It was the early 1930s, and Japan stood tall among the Pacific powers. The triumph in the Russo-Japanese War 2 decades earlier had stunned the world. A small Asian nation defeating a European giant? Unthinkable. World War I had only furthered Japan's gains, granting it territories and influence. The empire brimmed with pride, convinced that its destiny lay in shaping the future of Asia. But destiny doesn't come cheap. Behind the empire's dazzling facade was a sobering truth. Japan was starving for resources. Its industries hummed with progress, but the oil, iron, and rubber they needed were nowhere to be found on the rocky Japanese islands. The global Great Depression only made matters worse, as silk, Japan's economic lifeblood, fell out of fashion in a struggling world. The empire faced a choice: adapt and compromise, or expand and conquer. And the men in power had no appetite for compromise. The year was 1931, and a cold wind blew across the plains of Manchuria. A railway near Mukden exploded in the dead of night, the sound shattering the quiet. Japan's military blamed Chinese dissidents, though whispers of a staged attack lingered in the air. Whether truth or trickery, it didn't matter. The explosion was Japan's excuse to invade. Within months, the Japanese army had seized Manchuria and christened it Manchukuo, a puppet state dressed up as independence. In Tokyo, the invasion sent shockwaves through the political halls. Japan's civilian leaders had reservations, but their voices were drowned out by the rising roar of the military. Generals and admirals, hardened by ambition, began to take control. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Japan shrugged off their judgment like an uninvited guest at a banquet, leaving the League entirely in 1933. The Emperor, Hirohito, was still the face of the nation, but make no mistake, Japan was now marching to the drumbeat of its militarists. By 1937, the fields of Manchuria weren't enough to satisfy Japan's hunger. The empire turned its gaze south, where the vast lands of China stretched endlessly, promising resources and glory. The Marco Polo Bridge, an ancient stone relic near Beijing, became the flashpoint for war. Shots rang out one fateful night, igniting a conflict that would engulf the region. The Japanese army surged into China with terrifying speed, capturing key cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. However, Japan's military successes came at a horrific cost. The Nanjing Massacre from 1937 to 1938, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were killed, shocked the world and tarnished Japan's international reputation. Despite initial victories, Japan faced fierce resistance from Chinese forces, both the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. The prolonged war drained Japan's resources, leaving its economy stretched thin and highlighting the limits of its imperial ambitions. Instead of securing dominance in Asia, Japan became bogged down in an exhausting and expensive conflict. Beyond Asia, a storm was brewing. Japan's imperial ambitions didn't sit well with the Western powers. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands controlled much of the resources Japan desperately needed: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and critical trade routes across the Pacific. The tipping point came in 1940, when Japan marched into French Indochina. For Washington, this was a step too far. In 1941, the United States delivered its ultimatum in the form of an oil embargo. It was as if Japan's lifeblood had been cut off. Without oil, Japan's tanks would stop rolling, its ships would sit idle, and its planes would fall from the sky. For Japan's leaders, the choice was stark: surrender their ambitions or fight for survival. The decision was clear. War was inevitable. Desperation can lead to bold gambles. In 1940, Japan joined the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. The alliance was a calculated bet. If Germany dominated Europe, Japan could seize the opportunity to carve out its empire in Asia. But by late 1941, the empire's fuel tanks were nearly empty, and time was running out. In a smoky war room in Tokyo, military leaders gathered maps and charts, plotting a daring plan. If the United States was the gatekeeper of the Pacific, then Pearl Harbor was the gate. A preemptive strike, they believed, would cripple the U.S. fleet and buy Japan the time it needed to secure its empire. On December 7, 1941, the skies over Hawaii roared with the sound of Japanese planes. Bombs fell, ships burned, and history changed forever. Japan's gamble had begun, but it would cost them more than they could ever imagine. Japan's march into World War II wasn't a single step, but a series of calculated moves born from ambition, desperation, and a belief in destiny. From the icy fields of Manchuria to the fiery skies over Pearl Harbor, each decision carried the weight of an empire striving to reshape its place in the world. Yet beneath the surface of its bold ambitions lay cracks, overstretched resources, prolonged wars, and mounting international opposition. These cracks would ultimately shatter the dream of empire, leaving scars not only on Japan but across the globe. This is the story of how ambition met its limits, and how history's lessons remind us of the cost of unchecked power. Please comment, subscribe, and like.